I actually think this is my first time meeting you as well, so this is really exciting. And I also just want to thank you for being a part of the Expanding Our Roots interview series and just being on here to talk about your experiences and your story, and also just to be a part of this narrative that Louisiana is a place of consciousness and culture. We aren't always at the bottom of the list for every good thing and at the top of the list for every bad thing. And even when you look at those lists, the whole point of this series is to highlight the people in this community that are trying to get Louisiana to the top of the good list and at the bottom of the bad ones. And I usually start every conversation and interview with a very simple question. Where are you from? Where are you coming from?
I am from Laplace, small town right outside of the city on the other side of the lake, but not northwest. I always tell people it's about halfway between here and Baton Rouge, and if you need a bathroom break, that's where you're going to be, is Laplace. Some people don't believe I'm from Laplace because, like I said, it is a small town, not a lot going on there, but that's where I grew up. It's where I went to school. And then eventually I went to LSU, taught for a year in Homa, and then moved to California. I am from a multicultural home. So my dad is Black and from Louisiana, 5 generations. My family was enslaved in the same area of the state where I was raised. And my mother is from Korea. She's an immigrant. And so I'm first generation from her. And I grew up balancing those 2 identities my entire life.
So I want to ask you a little bit more about that because, you know, in your bio, you stated that you had this Afro-Asian background. And I know that Louisiana has a small Asian American population, but significant, qualitatively significant. But I also know that being in California, there's a much, much larger Asian American population. So what was it like going from Louisiana and then going to California, balancing both of these identities as a Black woman and also as an Asian woman, so Afro-Asian woman?
I didn't actually kind of take on the label of Afro-Asian until honestly maybe 2 years ago. But when I was growing up here in Louisiana, my mother was very intentional about having my brother and I involved in Korean community. And so we had piano lessons from a Korean teacher. We had Taekwondo from a Korean, we called him master. That's his title. And we also attended a lot of Korean celebrations and Lunar New Year events and things like that. And in those spaces, I didn't always feel 100% Korean. And, you know, and in those spaces, I wasn't seen as totally Korean. And the same way in Black spaces, I'm not always seen as totally Black a lot of times, or not sometimes, it depends. It's just kind of interesting trying to juggle those here where I always felt I had to kind of explain, or people would ask me if I didn't explain who I am and, you know, how do I fit into this situation here? Whereas when I was in California, there's just a huge population there. There's Koreatown. I have a few relatives that also are living in California. So I have an uncle that moved there from Korea, and I have a cousin as well. And it just felt a little more natural sometimes. There were just a lot of opportunities to be Korean with people and be in Korean spaces. And I'm still the same person and I still outwardly present the same, but there was just more of, I think, an understanding because of the way California is a bit more racially diverse. And I lived in Long Beach. And so Long Beach is one of the most diverse cities in the country. I didn't feel as if I had to explain myself more because I would start to notice in California that I was surrounded by a lot of brown people and everyone was just kind of brown. And you didn't really ask, you know, what kind of brown you were. It was just like, we're all existing in this ambiguity and this space of brownness. And it's all beautiful.
I can definitely relate to this idea of feeling like I am not enough, but more so when you go deep inside myself. Like when you see me, I'm Black. So I've never had to struggle with feeling as though I had to pick and choose an identity. So that's one thing I can't relate to. I can empathize with though, but I can definitely relate to this feeling of as though you're not completely understood. and then when you change your environment and where you are either growing up or where you're living, that can make a big difference in feeling supported and feeling as though you can be your authentic self. Like I definitely can relate to that.
Where are you from?
I'm from Baton Rouge. I grew up in Baton Rouge. I always say I spent 94% of my life in Baton Rouge. I lived in North Baton Rouge. Then I went to school all my life, K through 12 in Baton Rouge. But I've lived in other places like New Orleans. I went to UNO, and I spent a semester in Maryland. And I also lived about a year in New England for grad school to do the first year of my graduate program in Vermont and New Hampshire, which is where I live. So living in other places, I felt like in a place where everybody was different. Everybody was different culturally, ethnically, politically. You could be yourself because there was no litmus test. You didn't have to feel like, oh, I'm not completely this, I'm not completely that. Whereas where I was growing up in Baton Rouge, I always felt like I wasn't Black enough or I wasn't this enough. Whereas in other places, I could be as Black as I wanted to be. I could be as much of who I wanted to be or as little as who I wanted to be as possible and just be myself.
So Baton Rouge does have a small little space in my heart because I went to
Mhm.
LSU, and then I moved back. When I came back from California, I got a teaching job there, and so a lot of my closest friends live in Baton Rouge, and people kind of make fun of me because I go to Baton Rouge so frequently, back and forth.
Mhm.
But I don't love Baton Rouge as a city, but as a
Mhm.
state, and the people that I hold dear to my heart that live in Baton Rouge make Baton Rouge a special place to me.
I mean, it's always going to be home for me. It's always going to be home because that's where I grew up. I'm not one of those people where I feel like I'm going to rep where I live. I say I rep where I'm from, not where I stay. So I will always be a Baton Rouge native, but I always believed in my heart that there are some things that could happen in the city that I feel could make it a more open and welcoming place to live for people who are different in any kind of way. So where you feel like you didn't have to fit into a certain mold of being just to be given a sense of belonging, if you know what I mean. Well, speaking of Baton Rouge, you do a lot of work in both Baton Rouge and in New Orleans. You're involved in a lot of different organizations. You're involved in Front Yard Bikes and VR, the Asian Pacific American Society, the Faubourg St. Roch Improvement Association, and the Rotary Club of New Orleans. And you also founded Retreat, if that's the name of the organization. So you are involved in a lot. It's very, it may be difficult for you to answer this question because I'm asking you to like chronologically put everything together. But walk me through your journey of being involved in all these different organizations, going from one to the next. Was it chronological? Was it more organic? Just walk me through that journey.
You also didn't mention Black Masking Indian. 'Cause
Excuse me, Black. Yes, that too. I have all my notes because I do my research. I don't just come into an interview like, hey, I'm here. But even when I do my research and I'm trying to get my notes together, I'm just kind of like, I feel like I'm forgetting something, but they're gonna let me know if I'm forgetting it.
I guess a lot of this started with just when I was growing up. I just loved being involved with youth mentorship and tutoring and teaching and whatever that looked like. And eventually, when I moved to California, I was just out of college at that point. I was just trying to get involved. I didn't know anyone there, and I just had to figure out a way to get connected to community. And so I just started volunteering with a lot of different neighborhood associations and things like that. And then eventually, somebody approached me and asked me if I'd heard of the Rotary Club, and I didn't. And or the little bit that I knew, my assumption was, isn't that for like old white men or something? The answer is yes.
Yeah.
And so I started getting connected with Rotaract, which is the young professionals kind of branch of Rotary. And through that, it opened a lot of doors. And I started getting more involved in the Long Beach community and learned about community organizing and just being a community leader and like a resource person. And so then with Front Yard Bikes, Dustin and I have been close friends for over a decade, well over a decade at this point. We went to LSU together, and he started Front Yard Bikes when we were still kind of in college, and it was just this idea in his literal front yard. And then I was in California, and he started to do it more and more, and he was teaching, and then it became a nonprofit, and I said, I'm ready to step up in leadership. I want to participate in the board. And so I've been on that board, I think maybe 7 years now. Then when I moved to New Orleans, same thing. Like that's just kind of my go-to, is to get involved and get plugged in and be a part of community. And so I continued with Rotary Club here. And then my neighborhood association, I'm also on the board of, because, I can't live in a place and not contribute. So I found in this neighborhood, I'm going to be involved in what the neighborhood's doing. And then somehow a year or so ago, I got connected with APAS, the Asian Pacific American Society. And, I didn't necessarily know if it was going to be a place for me, honestly, because I thought it was people who were maybe either immigrants or who were fluent in their Asian language. And I just thought, maybe this is not where I'm going to fit in. And turns out it is a space that's growing. And I'm also on the board of that, which I was honored and surprised that they asked me to be on the board, because I just didn't know that I was going to represent the people that they were necessarily reaching out to. And then kind of in also a similar way, being a Black masking Indian, I mean, a lot of people are born into the culture, and it's been passed down in their family for generations and generations, and I honor and respect that culture. And I happened to get connected to my chief just through community involvement, and he was really interested in everything I was doing in the community, and then just asked me to come see his beading and asked me if I knew how. And I said, well, I do art, I can kind of figure it out. And I had kind of been shown the basics of beading. And so I showed him what I could do, and he was surprised. And then he said, okay, go home and work on a patch. And then he was surprised that I actually went home and did it. And I came back in a month and I said, okay, here's this giant patch that I made. And he said, lots of people say they want to get involved, but they don't actually follow through. And so then I wore my first suit a year ago in 2020 as the queen of the Black Seminoles of the 8th Ward.
And were you able to do that before the pandemic? Were you able to be in Mardi Gras and get involved in that?
Yeah, so we came out Carnival Day, but then St. Joe's, I think it was the night before, was when the city shut down. So I only officially wore my suit once. But then we did come together. Several of the Indians came together for protests, over the summer and everything that was happening. And some people suited up for some and different things like that. And there was one protest that was led by the younger generation of Indians, the younger teenagers, and no one wore their suits for that, but several of us had feathers on and things.
I don't know if you have the suit, but I would love to see it. So if you have any pictures of it, then let me know. I just think that that's like that's really cool. But I'm even looking at your background, and it seems like you got good fashion sense. Like you got a lot going on.
One piece of my suit is just sitting back there, actually.
Oh, really? Oh, cool.
To grab it? You want to see?
Yeah, go grab it.
I think the second piece that I made, it's a peacock.
Ooh, that's pretty.
And
that is gorgeous.
I had an idea to make it 3D, and I just went with it. I didn't exactly know how I was going to execute it, but I don't know. You just figure things out sometimes.
I think that's dopeness. That's dopeness and a half. And I'm also glad you were able to get to do that before the pandemic, because I know like Mardi Gras was like the last big thing that everybody in Louisiana was doing. And then the pandemic hit and things just went quiet. But I'm hoping that now that we're getting the vaccination campaigns going on and all these different things, we'll get to the other side of this. And then in 2022, you'll be back at it.
I started it right after last year. I started my suit that I thought was going to come out in 21, but now I have extra time to work on it. So
it's gonna be it's gonna be like fabulous. Yeah. I feel like this may be a difficult question to answer again, because I never ask easy questions. Like the easiest question is where are you from? Everything else is difficult. But you're involved in a lot. You're involved in all these different organizations. Collectively, how do you think the work that you do improves the communities that you work in? You're doing Front Yard Bikes, which I know is doing a lot of amazing things with, young people and wellness and biking and getting young people to like be a part of something, as opposed to oftentimes when I see young people being a featured versus being a part of that whole process. And then I'm also thinking about how integral the work of, the Asian Pacific American Society is in educating people about Asian culture and Asian American culture in Louisiana. Like, how do you think all these things improve these communities in South Louisiana?
Sometimes it does feel like I'm juggling a lot of plates, and every once in a while I think, am I scattering my energy too thin? Which maybe could be true. But I'm just realizing I didn't even talk about retreat. So maybe we'll talk about that later.
No,
But
talk about it, talk about it, talk about it real quick before you forget.
okay, so leading into that, I wrote this life's purpose statement a year ago. And I think this really just summarizes and helps me hone in exactly what it is that I am committing my energy to. And if it doesn't align with my life's purpose statement, then I just don't do it. And so the statement that I wrote is to live freely, wildly, and passionately, investing in youth and culture and aligning with powerful, purposeful, and equitable communities who are being the difference. And so that's it. Like, does it match my life's purpose statement? If not, then it's got to go. And so with retreat, this is an idea that I was inspired by a group that I was involved in Long Beach. And I thought, you know what, this has got to come to New Orleans. And really, it's a literacy opportunity for youth. And it's pretty simple. The idea is I set up a pop-up tent. I have a ton of books out there, and I have reading rewards for kids. They come, they read to volunteers, they get read to, they summarize, like do a summary comprehension of the book, explain what the book is about. And I do little evaluations so I can keep track of their growth. And then they earn currency from that I designed called cha-ching coins, it's a throwback to the old saints. And, and then they earn them and they can redeem them for reading rewards. And so, I try to challenge the youth. Do you want to spend all this now? Do you want to wait and read some more? Do you want to earn more? Do you want to get a bigger prize? So it teaches them financial literacy and also delayed gratification while incentivizing them to read. And then they realize, wait, I actually like this book. I want to read 3 more chapters because it's fun and I can get a better reward. And so it was an idea that I had at the beginning of this year to bring, and it just finally came into fruition. Sunday was our first pop-up, and I'm doing another one in 2 weeks in St. Roch neighborhood here. And then in May, I'll be over at the Community Book Center with Ms. Vera and Mama Jen doing it there. And so the idea is that we're going to travel around to different neighborhoods and areas in the city. And I feel like this is finally the manifestation of my intention to have all of the groups I am a part of come together and be that rainbow coalition I like to talk about and work under a purpose, a common purpose.
So I want to ask a question about 2 organizations that you're involved in, because you're involved in a lot, but I know in Baton Rouge, the front yard bikes is very well known. Like the mayor has participated in a lot of the projects. It's been on the news. And then also the Rotary Club is an international organization. So the New Orleans chapter is like one of thousands of chapters in the country. But I want to focus on 2 organizations. One is APAS, and which is one that you're involved in, but I don't know if a lot of people outside of the New Orleans area know about the kind of work that you all are doing. And I also want to ask you a little bit more about Retreat and ask you questions about that, because that's your project. That's something you started, you created. So with APAS, what kind of work do you all do in the community, specifically in New Orleans, but also just in the Southeast Louisiana region, if that's applicable?
With APAS, a lot of it is kind of like, in a way, what I was mentioning about the Rainbow Coalition. So there are representatives from each of the Asian communities that are on the board of APAS. So we have a representative from Korea, from Hong Kong, Vietnam, Philippines, and we represent 16 different Asian nations. And so each of those people then goes out to their communities, and it's a way to bring communities together, to build understanding, to come together to celebrate Asian heritage, to, be in a space that we wouldn't necessarily have otherwise. And also just to kind of like, in a way, educate people to where Asians are in this city and where they exist and the work that they're doing and in which corners of the city they are, so that we can all support each other.
So with APAS, I'm kind of hearing that it's an organization that is like raising awareness of culture in these different communities. And what I find is that a lot of people don't know a lot of Asian American history or about Asian Americans in a wider context. Like the first Filipino settlement in the United States was in St. Bernard Parish. The Vietnamese American community in Louisiana has contributed so much to contemporary culture. And there was also a Chinatown in New Orleans, for many, many decades. So the Asian American culture and history is present in Louisiana. But when you ask the average Louisianian to talk about that, it's very limited compared to our knowledge of Creole history or Black history or other Louisiana history. So, like, in your opinion, what are some misconceptions of the Asian American community, the Asian diaspora's community in Louisiana and also in New Orleans?
Honestly, I think that is kind of a delicate balance of those of us who are first generation and beyond. And honestly, if you want to call it white supremacy, but learning to assimilate, right? And so some of us, we have immigrant parents, and our parents wanted us to be American Asians. And so balancing that and trying to learn how to fit in and work in a way that gained you social mobility, but also holding on to your culture and being both of those things at the same time is really challenging. And so I do think some of those things were lost because of what there was to gain on the other side. And so unfortunately, some of that is history, and some of that are the stories that we don't necessarily share as often as we used to. And that is a sad part of the things that people have to give up in order. It's like when people talk about Italians and the Jewish community, what they had to give up culturally to become white, right? And so what the Asian community had to give up to be, instead of Asian Americans, but Americans and Asian. So I think that, yes, you're saying some of it was lost, a lot of it was lost, and a lot of it still exists, just maybe a little differently than what it looked like before.
I found out about APAS by doing research, like actually by researching and looking into the work that you all have been doing, and also a lot of other Asian American organizations in the New Orleans and Southeast Louisiana area, like Vela and other different organizations that have this presence in the community, but beyond the New Orleans area may not necessarily have a lot of like immediate knowledge. So when you think of the Rotary Club, oh yeah, the Rotary Club, I know the organization. Or in Baton Rouge, Dialogue on Race. Oh, Dialogue on Race, another organization. Front Yard Bikes, another organization. And then there are some that are doing good work, but may not be as wide known. They probably should be.
That's also the work with our Asian Heritage Festival that we have. And we have a picnic in the fall that we didn't have last year. But at the picnic, I really enjoy because it represents a little piece of culture, food culture from each of the nations that we have. And so holding on to those pieces is really important. And also, like I said, knowing how to pass on a lot of those things, because language is one of the first things to go when people move to a new country. And so I understand Korean. My mother speaks Korean to me sometimes, but she wanted me to make sure I was really fluent in English. And so she didn't force me to speak Korean. And so, there is kind of that hole, that longing where I have part of my language, but I don't have it all.
Earlier, you spoke about how you were kind of coming into the Rotary Club, which is known as like a mostly white male, old white male kind of organization, which it is. I'm sorry, it is. The Rotary Club is trying to diversify with more younger people and people of color and people from more diverse backgrounds. But I also know that a lot of organizations, some of them have a generational imbalance. We'll have more younger people than older folks, or more older folks than younger people. And when you talk about your experiences with the immigrant story in America, of some immigrants wanting to kind of embrace both of their cultures, and then some immigrants wanting to completely assimilate and become American, what I find is that older generations kind of have embraced the latter to survive. Whereas with younger generations, there's more of this idea of no, we are both all of these things. We are all of our identities. We're not just one identity or the other. We're everything. So with APAS, is APAS an intergenerational organization, and is it an organization that has this conversation where you're kind of balancing, hey, we need to embrace all of our cultures, not just being an American, but also being Vietnamese or Indian or Filipino or Korean. We need to balance all of these things and celebrate all of these things.
We have this kind of sentiment that we've been saying lately in APAS is we're not your parents' APAS. And so we're not totally intergenerational. I mean, I guess we span 2 generations right now, but we could be adding on people that are younger, and that is the goal. But I think right now what we are aiming to do is, because of so much of the focus on the Asian community right now, a lot of it is really just kind of building the bridge of understanding with people. Instead of just labeling us as Asian and having Asians being targeted, really kind of just asking people, why is it that you feel that you have these feelings and these beliefs and these stereotypes about Asian? Where is this even really coming from? And so I think that is a lot more of the focus right now, is just trying to get other people to understand us and our journey and our identity and our culture as a whole.
At the time of the interview, there's been a lot of conversation, not just around the hate crimes, which have always been an issue for Asian American folks and most marginalized communities, not just now, but there's this increased media attention to hate crimes towards Asian Americans, and also an increased media attention to history and culture, very similar to the reckoning that happened last summer with African Americans, where people were increasingly trying to understand and uplift, black voices. How do you feel like what's been happening recently has, if any way, transformed the kind of work that you all are doing at APAS?
I think that it is having us talk about race more, because I don't think that was necessarily happening. I came into APAS, like I said, I guess a year and a half ago. And I think that a lot of it was talking about cultural differences between each nation. But I don't think that we were necessarily talking about what our experiences are being in America and having a label of Asian. And I think that it's bringing that to the conversation even amongst our community more than I had heard it there before. And it's allowing people to share their stories of pain, of isolation, of otherness, in a way that it had never opened those doors previously. Because I think that even maybe as a generational gap, those things weren't spoken about as much. And so in our parents' generation, they were really, like you said earlier, just trying to kind of keep their head down and fit in and not cause waves. And now we're saying we need to talk about these things and we need to share our stories and we need to be loud. And this is our chance to do it.
I'm also seeing like this increased conversation of the intersections of injustice and oppression that communities of color as a whole are experiencing. Because I was reading this interesting article for a event that I attended with Dialogue on Race, where they talked about like the model minority myth and the issue and the commonalities and whites in experiencing white supremacy that Asian Americans and African Americans experience, where it's like kind of whiteness in a sense decided that at one point Asian Americans were threats to society. Then they decided that Asian Americans are not threats, they are the model minority. And African Americans were also trying to kind of create this identity for themselves as the model minority to combat white supremacy, but they were ignored and uplifted, and Asian Americans were uplifted as the model minority. But then now with the pandemic and other things happening in the world, Asian Americans are now a threat. This is all because I guess whiteness and white supremacy has kind of propped one minority over the other. And it's created this perception of division and strife between these two communities, which history shows have always, in a sense, given solidarity to one another, but that's not what the history reflects. What the media narrative of that history reflects.
It is challenging because white supremacy doesn't benefit anyone. Racism
right.
doesn't anyone. And as I said earlier, we all lose something when we're trying to be what the bar is for assimilation. No one wins in that case. And there have been, very clear examples of strife between Asian community and the Black community. If you think of California, and what happened there. And it's been interesting living in both of those identities fully, and last summer was the Black community. This summer is the Asian community. And it's really exhausting to have both of my identities be targeted and be the highlight in media and not in a positive way, and also to like hold space for both of these people is a lot. And also, in one hand, to also think about how some people, okay, so there are some Asians who were really supportive of the Black Lives Matter movement, but then there are other Asians who are kind of like you were saying earlier, the model minority, saying, well, I don't want to really get involved. I'll just let y'all handle it. And now that Asians are being targeted, it's like, we need to do something right now. And I'm just thinking, okay, and were you there for the Black community? Also, Black community, are you going to be there for the Asians that were there for you? Like, to me, like, I keep going back to this, my dream is just to have the Rainbow Coalition exist, and for all of these POC, BIPOC communities to exist together, because there's no other way that we're going to win. Stepping on top of each other to get to the top of the ladder is not going to reward anyone.
Yeah, I hear a lot from, I guess, I can't speak for the Asian American community because I'm not Asian American, but I can, as a Black person, I've often heard, well, why do we, like, we're Asian, speaking out against police brutality and all these different things, and why is it that everybody's focusing on them and we can't? And I'm like, that's a very tired, like, argument, honestly, because history shows that there are a lot of Asian Americans who have been radical in the movement of towards Black solidarity and Black liberation. I mean, I'm thinking about Grace Lee Boggs in Detroit and Yuri Kochiyama and so many other, Asian Americans who throughout history who have been in alignment with helping Black people and Black people who have been in alignment and advocating for Asian Americans as well. And even if every Asian American spoke out against police brutality towards African Americans, that's not going to stop the issue, because white supremacy is the issue that impacts us all. So until white supremacy is dismantled, then no one is truly going to win. So the back and forth doesn't always lead to actual progress or solidarity. It just leads to resentment. But I also share this desire for that rainbow coalition, because a lot of times people will say, oh, why do we always have to be together? We're so different. We're different. Yeah, we're different. But just like any family is different, if we want to think of ourselves as this family of people of color, I just think of it as a family where we all stick together. But even as family, you have to have tough conversations. You have to hold one another accountable. And you also have to be there for people when it's not easy. That is also part of that rainbow coalition and family thing that I'm also envisioning as well. It's not just, dancing in the sun off into the sunset. It's just being there for one another, which is the only way we'll be able to dismantle white supremacy. I actually wanted to ask you about the whole idea of choosing sides, because it feels like we see things in a binary, and you kind of answered the question, but we see things in a binary where last summer it was Black issues, and then the summer, and then now in the spring it's Asian issues. But there are some issues that oftentimes do get this space, like police brutality is given a Black face, like a Black people, that's a Black issue. Immigration is a Latino issue, and hate crimes are a Asian American issue. But all these communities experience all these issues at the same time. So you did say that you did have to choose, kind of feel like you were kind of choosing sides with your being Afro-Asian. But in what ways did you feel like you were able to have dialogue within the communities that you kind of exist in culturally about issues that impacted the other side? So in other words, maybe talking to African Americans about issues that impact you as an Afro-Asian woman, and also vice versa with issues that impact you, and issues that are Black issues that you maybe have conversations with about Asian American folks.
I think that a lot of where the healing is going to begin is relationships and through knowing someone. And so when the protest first started with George Floyd last summer, I just felt really emotionally burdened and overwhelmed. And I just didn't know how to convince people. And honestly, you will not convince people by giving them statistics, data, or stories. But you can start to soften someone's heart by building a relationship with them and having a one-on-one conversation when they know you. And I ended up just writing on Facebook, if you don't have anyone else in your life to ask about race, please reach out to me. And I was holding that space for people. And, some people immediately came to me and said, why are you doing this? You don't have to do this. This is not your burden. This is not your responsibility. That's a lot for you to do. And a few people accepted the offer and asked me questions, and it just opened up conversations with a handful of people. I mean, it wasn't like I had, fan mail pouring in or anything, but but I think that is really the answer to it, is getting to know someone. And even going back to where we were talking about Rotary and what I look like in a room of Rotarians, is kind of jarring to some people maybe who come in from the outside looking in. And I have visited Rotary clubs literally around the world, and the spaces look generally the same. I went to one in Italy, one in Iceland, one in Spain, and the spaces look very similar no matter where I am. And I've been to them in other cities around the US as well. And I think that just me being there and building relationships with people, and that's why, part of why I'm involved in Rotaries, I just really honor a lot of the work that they do. But I also realize that if I were not in Rotary, I would not necessarily interact with these people in any other capacity. I'd probably never cross paths with people in that room and in my Rotary club. And so I think the same is true for them looking at me, is they would never meet someone like me. And so if that is my one purpose in being in Rotary, is to build a personal connection so that I can open the door and begin to talk to people. And then all of a sudden, when the issue of police violence comes up and someone says, oh, I know someone who's Black and I know someone who protests against this, and I have a personal relationship with them, it makes a difference. And so I just think that that's where the answer to everything is building as many personal connections as possible.
And how do you go about doing that? You're involved in a lot, which I would assume means that you have a lot of relationships, professional, personal, social. I mean, you even talked about being good friends with Dustin. And when I'm just thinking about the fact that none of your work can be successful if you don't build community with people. So like, what are some ways that you are able to build community and build relationships with people who are different and who are maybe different culturally, different in interests, different in political beliefs? Like, what is your kind of take on that whole thing?
I think that I differ in some people, even my own partner, in this approach. But I kind of see it as, if we have one common point of connection, let's work on that. If we don't agree on 5 other points, that's okay. We can have a relationship as long as we can be humane, be cordial toward each other, and have a conversation. And I have this friend, he and I have been friends, I think 15 years now. And we're hanging out a week ago, and he is a cowboy. He was a bull rider. He voted for Trump, and like, we could not be more different at all. And we have been in each other's lives 15 plus years, and we don't have a ton in common, but we have a relationship. We just have a long-term friendship that's happened, and we don't have to talk about everything, but we can talk about just being human and emotions and experiences. And we build a relationship through that. And it's kind of like when you have a sibling or a cousin, and, like, you're like, well, we aren't best friends, but we're in each other's lives and we're related and we're family. And that's why we have to get along. I kind of view people in that way. Like, we get along because we're human. We have one thing in common, and we know how to just respect each other. And I can build on that.
I feel like what I would describe when you're interacting with people who are different from you is what I call empathetic disagreement. Like, you may disagree with someone, but you understand why they have the position that they have, or come from the place that they come from, and make space for them. Because a lot of times people assume that, you can be friends with somebody who's different from you, and just not talk about the things that you differ on or disagree on or have contrasting views on. And that's impossible. But if you're able to understand where people are coming from in a way that's true to yourself, but also empathetic, then you're able to kind of have a stronger foundation for a relationship, because you're seen as a human being, not as a caricature of a human being.
Right.
And I'm also just thinking about the relationships I've had in my life with people who are different from me, very different from me, and how those relationships weren't built because we found this one thing we had in common, but because we were just authentically ourselves. And people are attracted to honesty. People are attracted to authenticity and being in people who are genuine. Like, I am who I am. These are my experiences. I'm putting myself on the table. This, I'm being vulnerable. I'm being unvarnished. Here I am. And then people are like, okay, well, I might not like, I might have a disagreement with you. Or I may not see things just in your point of view, but I respect that you feel the way that you feel.
It's funny because you're talking about being yourself and authenticity, and that is so important to me in the way that I interact with people and the people that I choose to have in my life, as far as being authentic. And at the same time, code switching. And I just think about how I am able to navigate a lot of these spaces. So I've talked about my Black community and my Black family, and then my Korean community, my Korean family. And then the third kind of my trifecta of identities is that I grew up in a predominantly white neighborhood. I went to a totally white, conservative, basically Republican Southern Baptist church. And my high school was 96% white. And so I have navigated a lot of white spaces throughout my entire life. And many of my friends growing up were white. And, when I think about that, I do think about maybe what I lost in some of those spaces, but I also think of what I gained. And what I gained is knowing how to code switch so that I can present myself as someone that is accepted in Rotary Club, even with all my stuff and my hair and my jewelry and everything. But I can go in there and I can sit and have a conversation with these people about topics in a way that doesn't feel threatening to them, that feels relatable. And so even in being authentic, there's a code switching that still feels authentic to me. It's just tailored slightly to each audience.
Right. Like, I will use the same language, but I may not use the same terminology, and I might not have the same approach because, when you're in the Rotary Club, you can't have the same vocabulary and the same ways of expressing yourself that you would use if you were going to like a racial justice organization. Not because the values aren't there, but because the language is different. There's culture and generation, as well as in culture and in so many different parts of our lives, that sometimes people may understand where you're coming from if you use language that is accessible to them, both whether it's upper class, working class, immigrant communities. Everybody has a culture, but you can still code switch, as you're saying, and be yourself, because these are different versions of yourself. These are different pieces of yourself that you bring to the table.
And they all coexist simultaneously.
Well, that's actually kind of brings me to like the kind of like my last couple of questions that I wanted to ask you, because a lot of the people that I've interviewed, they're usually involved in like one organization, or it's like I represent this one organization, or I represent this one group. And it's easy to kind of talk about one organization that you're involved in. But even when I was like thinking about the questions I wanted to ask you and the conversation I wanted to have, I was like, I don't want her to feel like I'm only going to ask about one organization, because I feel like every organization has value, and every organization that you're involved in is almost like an extension of yourself, right? Because I know for me, I do the AIDS One Project, but I'm also involved in so many other things that are extensions of my interest in who I am as a person. So how do you feel like these different organizations that you're involved in, whether they are the ones that you created or the ones that you are on the board of, the ones that you're members of, represent the different sides of you as a human being and also as Angel, the person?
I think at the end of the day, I thrive on being intimately connected to people. And so that's really just kind of the summary of it. And in addition to that, investing in youth. I mean, that is what a lot of my work comes back to, is just me asking myself, what am I setting up the youth for? What am I investing in the next generation for? And so I'm also an educator, and there's just so much in that, because, one day I won't be here, but if I'm not leaving a legacy so that the next generation can thrive and be successful, then what's the point? If I'm not teaching youth to be connected to each other and to be connected to the earth, then there's just no reason.
Right. My mom would always say you don't live in the world by yourself. Like, and when you embody and embrace this idea that you don't live in the world by yourself, it feels as though you're able to realize that there's so much you can do to contribute to your community, because we all are impacted by each other's actions and our own actions as well.
There's just a lot to learn in how much interconnectedness there is just in the universe, in between people, in between us and any living thing, even plants. I'm actually starting a new job in the fall, being a garden teacher. And so, like, just thinking about life and the cycles and relationships and connections in that way, how it's not just about living beings such as animals that run around, but even the plants and what goes into our body and what comes out, and how, our spirit coexists in that.
Everything is connected. Everything in life is connected. Some kids are doing, like, outside the door, they're doing like kiddie Olympic trials for track or something. Like, they're literally running in the hallway. I'm like, what is going on? But yeah. Well, I have one last question to ask you. Look, there's so many more questions I want to ask you, because I feel like there's so much more to, like, your bio that I want to get in. But this last question, I hope, will help you kind of wrap this whole conversation we have with a pretty bow on it. Because I know that you've probably been interviewed and maybe interviewed or talked to people, and you've left the conversation feeling like, man, I should have asked this question. Man, I wish I got a chance to talk about this. And I don't want you to be that way. I don't want you to log out and be like, man, why didn't he ask me about this? Like, I didn't get a chance to talk about this. I didn't get a chance to say this. So the question I want to ask to kind of wrap up the conversation is, what are some things that you'd like to express, or you'd like to kind of maybe talk a little bit more about, that you haven't had a chance to talk about during the course of this conversation that I'm having?
I guess the last thing that I would like to say is that I consider myself an open invitation. So, if people want to connect with me, if people want to reach out with me, support any of the work that I'm doing, meet up, talk about how we can be in relationship and community together, then I'm here for it. So, whatever that looks like, if your work fits into my life's purpose statement that I said earlier, live freely, wildly, and passionately, investing in youth and culture, and aligning with powerful, purposeful, and equitable communities who are being the difference. If you align with that and you want to move that work forward, come at me.
I mean, I'm already involved and aware of the work that Front Yard Bikes does, but I definitely will be finding ways to get involved with the other work that you're doing. And then, of course, the thing I always want to express to people who are in the Expanding Our Roots, series, is that this is not one of those one and done kind of things. I'm not just going to ask you to be a part of this conversation and you'll never hear from me again. Like, this is one of those, I want to bring you into my work with a 2-1, and I also want to be a part of your work as well. So I will also be getting involved with the different things that you are doing, Angel, and also finding ways to support you, whether it's by showing up, whether it's by amplifying the work that you do. I want to also make space as well. But Angel, I appreciate you taking the time to talk to me and express yourself. I hope that this was an opportunity for you to fully kind of talk about you as a person, and also the very diverse work that you do in the Baton Rouge and New Orleans communities. And also, my hope is that you're able to wear that really sick Mardi Gras costume for Mardi Gras, because it is amazing.
We call it a suit, so my Indian suit.
Your suit, excuse me. Oh my God, your suit. You need to, I hope that people need to get vaccinated. People need to get vaccinated. They need to get their stuff together so that way you can wear that suit for Mardi Gras. If anyone is watching or listening to this conversation, please get your shot, get vaccinated, social distance, do what you need to do so we can get to the other side so that Angel can wear that fabulous Mardi Gras suit that she has. Thank you again, Angel. Thank you.
This was wonderful.